All right. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for being here, for supporting us. My project is based around my almost complete dissertation titled 18th Century Sensibility in the Subversive Female Body. My primary goal with the lab was to search for all texts in echo that included sighing, trembling, and fainting. And broadly, I'm studying how women wrote about the body in 18th century literature, and the digital humanities aspect of this project effectively catalogs texts that include actions of sensibility. So prior to the fellowship, I had been really struggling to read hard copies of text, to look things up in Echo, and then data enter a handmade database. So like, for instance, reading a book, I would write down every single page number that a sigh or any number of the dozens of synonyms of sigh occurred, and then put it in a database. It was awful. It was really arduous. So that's what's on the screen right now, and I managed just over 1,000 texts, 1,018 texts. Access to the lab allowed me the opportunity to gather really large amounts of data, which obviously gives me a far more complete picture of these patterns. The data pulled from the lab, not only does it not have all of my inevitable human errors, but it also gave me 50,308 texts, which is 50 times what I had. It obviously gives me, again, a far more complete picture of these patterns. So the lab allowed me to nearly instantaneously build data that would have taken years, if it was even possible to create by hand. And it allowed me to find all text housed in Echo that included sighs, trembles, and faints, along with the dozens of key synonyms like quivering, quavering, etc. And it resulted in this number of hits. So given that I'm looking at bodily trends, for the sake of this project, specific documents weren't as pertinent to me. But what is exciting is how all of this will be pertinent after my defense, hopefully this semester. I'll be using the data drawn from the lab to do the distant reading work that will allow me to hone in on close readings of particularly representative texts that very well may be far outside the canon that nobody has even looked at yet. So in terms of the tools that I used for my project, it turned out that the Ngram tool was most useful. And here's a look at the visualization that tool can provide. In order to get to those terms, as well as getting the exact number of sighs, trembles, and faints per each text, I had to clean the data over and over. So I would get like the first 100 terms for my data set. So for example, something like that, and then scrub out all of the terms that weren't related to my study. And you can see at the bottom of the screen, I don't know if you can tell, but there's like a funnily spelled OCR version of the word majority. And then there's the word consummated, both of which, if I had continued cleaning, would have been scrubbed out of my data. But I underwent this cleaning process hundreds of times to get to the terms I needed, but I largely got there. And when I downloaded the metadata from the lab, it gave me some really interesting findings. What I got was something that looked like this. This looks quite terrifying to my non-coder eyes, so I'll zoom in a bit and show you the type of data that it offers. So for ease of viewing, I circled some data that's pertinent to my study. You'll notice on the right that I get Gale's document ID number. It's the one starting with CB. And just to the right of that, I get the count for the term that I'm looking at for that particular ID. So I know that there are 14 instances of the term in question in this particular document. To the left of that, I get the term that the count refers to, which in this case is fainted. And just to the right of that, I get all of the count of all faints in this particular data set. And that's the other thing, is you create different data sets to run different reports on. So in this data set, there are a total of 546 uses of the word fainted, 14 of which are in the particular document that I circled. And this also gives you the frequency percentage of that word's usage as compared to all of the words in the data set. And I haven't done much with that yet, but I will as I proceed further into my work. So I I can take that Gale ID over to Echo to take a closer look at the document with 14 hits. And it just so happened that the text that I arbitrarily chose was the Bible. But if you look at the left side of the screen, you'll see the page numbers for each instance of the term fainted. And if you click on any of the page numbers, and I imagine we're all familiar with Echo, but for the sake of showing you, and I arbitrarily chose page 638. It brings me directly to that page, and it highlights the word fainted. And, it's possible that there could have been a few faints on this page. In this case, there weren't. So hypothetically, I could pick the text in all 50,000 hits of my database that has the highest number of faints and start a close reading analysis of faints in that text. And it's really the numbers that point me in that direction. But back to the reports and the metadata. So having access to this data was really groundbreaking for me. With the CSV file of 50,000 texts and JSON metadata files in hand, I'm able to organize and parse data on bodily sensibility in almost any configuration. For example, I might sort all 51,000 lines by decade to determine key terms over time, or I might find how many texts include sighs, trembles, and faints compared to just trembles and faints, or I might search for trembles by decade to see how frequently they were used in the different periods of the century. But in short, I'm able to perform research that simply wouldn't have been possible without access to this data. Currently, I'm working on trying to figure out how to merge the 50,000 CSV file with in the neighborhood of 20 JSON files in order to put all of this information together into a single database. So if anyone has any suggestions, please help me. I will happily take any help that I can get. But back to the broader scale. Here are a couple of examples of broader findings that are important to my work. Of the 51,308 texts in Echo published between 1701 and 1800 that have any number of sighs, trembles, or faints, 47,183 of the documents are published by men or are of unknown authorship, and only 4,125 are published by women or are designated as by a lady or by a young lady of influence or any number of the other female signifiers. What this means is that women-authored texts are a mere 8% of texts archived in Echo that include sighing, trembling, and fainting. The extent of this disparity honestly startled me, and it allows new questions that I've only just started thinking about. Like future research might involve looking at all of Echo by gender to determine if all types of texts, not just those involving bodily sensibility, follow in similar vein. But for the purposes of my dissertation, for data on women writers alone, the findings by decade are pretty striking. The period from 1780 to 1800 holds more than half of the texts by women writers. And texts by women writers 1770 through the end of the period are a whopping 68% of the total. This means that in the first 70 years of the period, it accounts for only slightly over 30% of the total texts by women in Echo. Now, this isn't altogether surprising. I won't get into all the details of it now, but there are many book history-related reasons that this might be the case. But all of this made me curious about the 51,000 data set on the whole. And running those numbers again, of which, again, only 8% are designated by women, we find something pretty interesting. We see that there's a slightly lower percentage of texts by or designated by women as compared to all texts in the first 3 decades of the century. And you see the women's on the right, and you see all texts on the left. This disparity increases for each decade through 1779. But in the 1780s, women's texts account for 21% of their total over the century, compared to just 15% for all texts. And by the last decade, women's texts account for just over 37%, as compared to just over 23% when we run the numbers for all texts. These early findings, they suggest many different things. It's possible that women were simply publishing proportionally more frequently in the later decades of the 18th century. It's possible that women were publishing proportionally more frequently on sensibility later in the century. It's also possible that more texts by women were saved and archived in the period later to be found by 20th and 21st century librarians and scholars. But in any event, this preliminary data suggests that women's literature that included sensibility proliferated in the later decades and beyond that of texts by men and women. So I'll stop there for now, but just one more thing. After my defense, I plan to have the database peer-reviewed and then made open access. I'd love to have the opportunity to collaborate with others and also just have have others potentially use and maybe even add to this data. So please be in touch with me if you are interested, and also if you have suggestions for how I can best merge the CSV and JSON files. Please help me. And thanks so much, everybody.